Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is episode 31, Alien Artifacts and Alien Contact. Alien artifacts may seem like a bit of an odd direction to go here, since I've already talked about two of the definitive Alien Artifacts novels in the two previous episodes, Ringworld and Rendezvous with Rama. And honestly, the Space Odyssey series counts too. But there were some important works that followed on from these, like Gateway and Sphere, which means that we haven't fully explored the trope yet. And in this episode, I'm also grouping in tales of alien first contact, like, naturally, Carl Sagan's Contact, along with movies like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. These were nowhere near the first contact stories around, but they are some of the most notable titles to look at peaceful first contact through a hard sci-fi lens. This trope was becoming prominent around the same time as the alien artifact stories, and it also shares a lot of similarities with them. These are stories where the aliens are mysterious, a puzzle to be figured out despite their efforts to talk to us. Not because they're inscrutable godlike beings, nor because they're too strange for us to comprehend, although there's some overlap, but just because we don't know much about them, and we don't have any cultural reference points. In many stories in both categories, we do go on to make direct contact and learn more about them, but they're certainly not landing on the White House lawn or inviting us to join the Space United Nations. There also seem to be a disproportionate number of movies in these categories. Alongside Close Encounters, we have E.T., even though it has a very different plotline. A little bit later, Flight of the Navigator shares some similarities. Then there's the original Stargate, and the movie version of Contact, and the more recent films Prometheus and Arrival are textbook cases. You might even toss in some more peripheral examples like The Abyss, The Iron Giant, and District 9. I don't think this is down to the subject matter so much as it is that we're starting to move into the 80s now, when sci-fi movies were taking off like they hadn't done before. I'll talk a bit more about that in the next episode with Star Wars, but most of the episodes moving forward have a larger share of films. This is the period when sci-fi was going more mainstream, and Hollywood reflects that. Let's start with the alien artifacts. In these stories, the aliens are largely absent. We only know of them through the mysterious creations they left behind. These artifacts are often still functional, and may even try to communicate with us in some way, but they also may be completely derelict and indifferent, like Rama. Or we may be able to use them to make direct contact, as in Stargate. But in the moment, they are almost always abandoned by their builders. As I said, the three most prominent stories in this subgenre are probably 2001: A Space Odyssey, Rendezvous with Rama, and Ringworld. However, there are several other classic sci-fi novels that deal with alien artifacts, starting with Frederick Pohl's breakout novel Gateway, the first of his Heechee saga. As an aside, in one of the most unusual collaborations I've seen in the genre, an 89-year-old Pohl and a 90-year-old Arthur Clarke co-wrote Clarke's very last novel, appropriately titled The Last Theorem. That must have been an interesting email chain. Gateway is significantly different from those earlier books, in that it's a story of established contact, for lack of a better term. By that, I mean that the artifact, the titular Gateway, has been in human hands for many years, long enough for us to jury-rig an admittedly very dangerous system of using it for ourselves, even though we still don't understand it. Gateway is a hollowed-out asteroid filled with small, faster-than-light alien spaceships. Each ship is tiny, able to carry only 1 to 5 people, and comes with a pre-programmed address book of destinations. Unfortunately, the humans don't know how to read the address book, so they just have to pick destinations at random. They have no idea if the destination will be safe or habitable, and they can't even predict how long the journey will take. All efforts to reverse engineer the ships or even control them beyond punching in an address have ended in failure. Despite the danger, Gateway has sparked a sort of interstellar gold rush, with those brave enough to go paid huge amounts of money in proportion to the estimated danger of the trip. Gateway is also unusual in that it's told through the frame story of a former Gateway pilot, Bob Broadhead, in therapy sessions with his robotic psychologist, Siegfried von Schrink. We don't know why he's in therapy, but it's clear that Bob was traumatized by his time on Gateway, because he becomes violently combative whenever Siegfried pushes him to confront his actions there. It's a very clever storytelling device, as the reader is left to piece together what happened as we go, in parallel with Bob piecing his damaged psyche and memories back together. To be honest though, Gateway didn't hold my interest all that much, certainly not enough to read the rest of the series, but it's still a good story. And at risk of hinting at spoilers, I've actually recommended it previously as an alternative to Tom Godwin's The Cold Equations. Gateway explores similar themes, but does it in a more sensible way, and actually gets at the consequences of the protagonist's actions. I could see the pilot in The Cold Equations seeing his own Siegfried von Schrink in a more serious treatment of that story. Another interesting twist on the theme comes from Michael Crichton's Sphere. Crichton will be getting his own episode later on, so I won't say much about it now. But in short, Sphere tells of an expedition to explore what appears to be an alien spaceship crashed on the ocean floor. But on closer inspection, it turns out not to be an alien ship, but a human-built ship from the future. And I might also include in this category Dan Simmons' Hyperion cantos. Hyperion is a story that seems to defy classification in the categories as I've established them. And that's before you get to its unusual structure, which is essentially a retelling of the Canterbury Tales in space. Hyperion is a planet that has been colonized by an interstellar human empire, but nonetheless holds mysteries that no one can figure out. It does have artifacts, the mysterious time tombs, structures that appear to be aging backwards, suggesting that whatever is buried in them will be unearthed at some point in the future. And it has aliens, or rather one alien, a frightening being called the Shrike, which guards the tombs. No one is really sure what the Shrike is, except that it is very powerful, has control over time and space, and if you meet it, and you're very lucky, it will grant you a wish. If you're unlucky, you'll wind up in an almost literal hell of the Shrike's own creation. I've heard a lot of good things about the Hyperion cantos, but I just couldn't get into them either. The structure didn't work for me. I've said before that short fiction and anthologies are one of my weak points in the genre, but maybe it'll work for you. I really do like alien artifact stories. It's just that I enjoyed Rama and Ringworld a lot more than these later ones. Anyway, I can't very well talk about alien artifacts without mentioning Stargate. Stargate is the sci-fi story for the ancient aliens and aliens built the pyramids tropes. For more on those tropes in particular, see my recent interview with Dr. Benjamin Stevens. However, if you're not familiar with the plot of the movie, a strange ring-shaped artifact is dug up in Egypt, along with manuscripts indicating that the pyramids were once landing sites for alien spaceships. Once they decipher them, the humans realize that the ring can be used to create wormholes to other planets. A military team goes through the wormhole and immediately finds itself having to fight alien overlords who were the inspiration for the Egyptian gods. I've only seen the movie once, but I very much enjoyed the spin-offs. 4 television series, including the animated Stargate Infinity, 2 direct-to-DVD movies, and what appears to be a serious effort toward a new TV series currently in the works, so stay tuned on that. I haven't seen Infinity, but I can definitely recommend all of the live-action stuff. Meanwhile, Alien First Contact stories have a lot of parallels with alien artifacts, and perhaps the quintessential example comes from the Alien First Contact story in hard sci-fi, Contact, by Carl Sagan. In Contact, we don't have direct communication or interaction with aliens, at least not until the end. Limited by the speed of light, we have only radio signals beamed across interstellar space. And even though these signals are designed to be decipherable, it still takes a lot of effort to decipher them, and there are a few unintuitive components. You might even say that the message is a mysterious digital artifact. And as a bonus, the message tells us how to build a strange machine of our own that we still don't really understand even after we turn it on. You don't get much more hard sci-fi than Contact. Carl Sagan was a planetary scientist who had done some direct work in radio astronomy, such as his studies of Venus, and with SETI. Plus, he was already a famous science communicator through Cosmos. The result is to this day one of our best guesses at what alien contact may look like in the real world. Not the big wormhole machine, but the radio message. And in the years since, people have criticized that the aliens wouldn't have actually been able to pick up the broadcast of the 1936 Olympics, but from my admittedly limited understanding of the science, I think this is an engineering problem rather than a physics problem, if you're looking in the right direction. The return message is exactly what we would expect from aliens who are trying to communicate with us. It takes a while to figure it out, but they don't obfuscate it. It starts with simple mathematics, includes instructions for its own translation, and goes into exacting detail about how to build the alien machine. In fact, I've got 1 or 2 fiction projects on the back burner that are something of an homage to Sagan's work, but that's a story for another day. Sagan also doesn't shy away from religious themes, which is perhaps surprising on a surface level seeing as he was an agnostic and a consummate skeptic, but I think it's very much in line with his other work. Some of it is dated, like how the people in charge were so resistant to sending an atheist on the mission, but much of it is still deeply meaningful today. Although I honestly don't believe that trick with the value of pi is possible. All in all, it's a very entertaining story, something that I only made this association when I was writing the script for this episode, but it has a very Robert Heinlein feel about it. And indeed, Heinlein was one of Sagan's inspirations. Sagan had Heinlein's gift of taking the minutiae of the science and telling it in a way that was as interesting as the plot itself, which of course he'd already proven with Cosmos. The story is deeply rooted in real science, even to the point of the protagonist Ellie Arroway famously being based on real-life SETI pioneer Jill Tarter. At the same time, Sagan was also perfectly willing to engage in social commentary, also like Heinlein, although he was far less of an iconoclast. And I contend that Contact paved the way for similar later stories. Certainly Ted Chiang's Story of Your Life and its movie adaptation Arrival share many similarities with Contact, although they owe just as much to Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. And realistically, I have to question how hard the heptapods were trying. It's true that their minds work so differently from ours that we can barely understand each other even with translation, but you'd think they could figure out enough to start out with 2 + 2. Also, a certain recent novel goes pretty deep into this territory, but I don't want to spoil it. Check out my blog if you really don't mind the spoilers. But that shortcoming in Arrival leads into another famous alien contact story, Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Again, not the first such story, but one of the big ones that reimagined and influenced the subgenre from then on. Much like Stargate, Spielberg dips into conspiracy theories to build a story with what seems a haunting plausibility. Alien abductions, missing time, implanted memories, and of course government cover-ups. It's a softer sci-fi, but still one rooted in our American cultural zeitgeist regarding aliens. As it happens, these aliens are benevolent, or as benevolent as they can be after abducting a bunch of people. They do return them. But, like Arrival, they do things with language that don't make a lot of sense. They communicate a greeting with their famous 5-note phrase. And the government scientists go on to communicate with them in a mathematical and musical language. All of that's actually pretty good in principle. The problem is that it's not at all clear to me how the scientists actually knew what the notes meant. Spielberg, of course, would go on to direct E.T. a few years later. This is a different kind of alien contact story, one of an alien stranded on Earth who is trying to get home. And again, an alien with psychic powers. And in this movie also, the idea of alien communication is of prime importance, both between alien and humans, and through E.T. phoning home. The rest of the film takes a more whimsical approach, though. I mean, considering E.T.'s childlike innocence, his mystification by human technology, and his willingness to eat a trail of Reese's Pieces off the ground when he's presumably an experienced adult space traveler, you can tell it's meant as a children's story, and definitely leaning toward the fantasy side. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a really good movie. I just don't think you're watching it for the science. The complications of communication with aliens has a longer tradition in literature than this particular wave of stories suggests on its own, going back to Stanisław Lem's Solaris and Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land, or even earlier with C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet. And there are newer books like Liu Cixin's The Three-Body Problem. However, there's one more rather unusual instance in a book that frequently makes lists of modern classics, if not in so many words. I'll talk more about what I mean by modern classics in a later episode. Anyway, this book is The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell from 1996, and its sequel, Children of God. And in this case, I really consider the two to be a single work. The Sparrow feels incomplete without Children of God. The Sparrow, at first, seems like a more traditional space exploration narrative. Humans discover radio signals coming from Alpha Centauri and build a ship to go there. One unusual aspect is that the Catholic Church gets involved and sends a Jesuit priest and linguist. Now, this sounds like a very similar plot to James Blish's A Case of Conscience from 1958, with the protagonist even having a similar name. But Mary Doria Russell claims this was entirely coincidental. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on here, including some interesting speculative biology. See my interview with Daniel Benson for an overview of that topic. But what's relevant to this episode is the role of language in the story. You see, the Church got involved in part because the radio broadcasts from Alpha Centauri were playing music that sounded suspiciously like religious hymns. It's not until well after, Emilio Sandoz and company land on the planet Rakat, that they realize they weren't religious broadcasts, far from it. And in fact, they understood the language as a whole much less than they thought, with deadly consequences. And in parallel with another one of the books I've mentioned, the story of the Sparrow is told in flashbacks after Sandoz returns to Earth a broken man, and slowly works through the psychological trauma he was subjected to on Rakat. It's a good story, although, fair warning, it gets pretty dark and definitely deals with mature themes. And at this point, I feel like the theme of this episode has deviated a bit, but I think it's an important aspect. A close look at communication is critical to realistic alien contact stories, and oftentimes, learning about artifacts means decoding alien languages too. It's not as glamorous as grand vistas and exotic technology, but there are absolutely authors who can do brilliant work with it. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is produced by, well, me. I don't have a staff or anything. This is why I never know what to say in place of credits. Anyway, it's hosted by Libsyn, and it's mirrored pretty much anywhere else the average listener finds podcasts. I am now easier to find on YouTube. Just search for Science Meets Fiction, that's the new channel name, and it should come right up. And my website, as always, is sciencemeetsfiction.com. My book recommendation for this episode, as you might be able to tell, is Contact by Carl Sagan. This is a book that shows how science works and how a realistic alien contact is likely to work from someone who really knows his stuff and knows how to spin a good tale at the same time. It's definitely worth the read. In the next episode, we pull back and take a look at the large-scale view with tales of galactic civilizations. And yes, this is where we get to Star Wars. Thanks for listening.